Have you ever wondered what truly happened behind the dense jungles and fiery battlegrounds of one of the most controversial conflicts in modern history? Prepare yourself for a gripping journey into the heart of the Vietnam War, an event that changed nations, challenged ideologies, and shaped an entire generation. From the secret strategies to the hidden stories of survival, this is your front row seat to an extraordinary narrative, filled with bravery, turmoil, and global impact. Stay tuned, because we're about to unearth the raw truth and dive deeper into a war that still resonates in our world's collective conscience. Welcome, everyone, to our comprehensive exploration of the Vietnam War, an intense conflict that spanned 2 decades, fueled heated debates across the globe, and influenced countless lives both on and off the battlefield. In this video, we will delve into the complex origins of the war, the ideologies that set the stage for confrontation, and the numerous turning points that defined its trajectory. We'll look at pivotal battles, political maneuverings, the experiences of soldiers from North and South Vietnam, as well as the United States and its allies. We'll also examine how the media's powerful coverage changed public opinion, influenced policy decisions, and continues to shape global perceptions of this controversial era. Get ready for a remarkable journey, because we're going to pull back the curtain on a war that has been studied, criticized, and analyzed, yet still carries untold stories and valuable lessons for the modern world. To truly understand the Vietnam War, we must first turn our gaze to the broader historical context. During the mid-20th century, the world was deeply enmeshed in the Cold War, a global standoff primarily between the United States and the Soviet Union, each championing its own vision of governance and economics. This ideological clash between capitalism and communism fueled proxy wars in various corners of the globe. Vietnam became one such battleground, where both superpowers saw an opportunity to expand or contain spheres of influence. Yet, beyond these grand power plays, the Vietnam War was also shaped by local dynamics, including years of colonial rule under France, rising nationalist sentiments, and the divide between North Vietnam's communist regime, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the South Vietnamese government, supported heavily by the United States. This confluence of international and domestic factors created a perfect storm that escalated into a conflict of massive proportion. Before the Vietnam War fully erupted into the long, grueling engagement many remember today, Vietnam had already been through the First Indochina War, 1946 to 1954. That earlier conflict pitted the French colonial forces against the Viet Minh, a national independence coalition spearheaded by Ho Chi Minh. As French control weakened, the Viet Minh sought complete autonomy for Vietnam. The result was the eventual fall of French forces at the famed Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. This critical defeat forced France to negotiate, culminating in the Geneva Accords of the same year. The Accords intended to create a roadmap for peace by temporarily dividing Vietnam at the 17th parallel, with the promise of nationwide elections to unify the country in the near future. However, tensions mounted as both North and South Vietnam jostled for complete authority over the entire territory, setting the stage for the war to come. The division at the 17th parallel was meant to be a short-lived measure, but it proved to be the seed of deeper conflict. Ho Chi Minh, revered by many in the North for his fierce opposition to colonialism, led the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North Vietnam. In the South, under President Ngo Dinh Diem, the Republic of Vietnam was born. The Diem government, supported financially and politically by the United States, was wary of communist expansion, and the US saw Diem as a bulwark against the so-called Domino Theory. This popular theory asserted that if one nation fell to communism, neighboring countries would follow in a domino-like chain reaction. Determined to prevent this ideological cascade, the United States bolstered South Vietnam, hoping to maintain a non-communist government in Saigon. However, Diem's regime soon became notorious for corruption, nepotism, and persecution of religious communities, especially Buddhists, which in turn fueled growing domestic opposition and dissent. As the cracks in Diem's leadership became more evident, communist insurgents in the south, known as the Viet Cong, began to organize resistance to the regime. Supported both politically and logistically by the North through the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the Viet Cong carried out guerrilla warfare tactics, ambushes, and sabotage across the rural areas of South Vietnam. Their goal was straightforward: destabilize the South from within and pave the way for a unified communist Vietnam. Meanwhile, the U.S. watched nervously from afar, pouring more resources into advising and training the South Vietnamese army, hoping to shore up Diem's government. The conflict slowly escalated from limited engagements to more direct confrontations, setting the wheels in motion for full-fledged war. One of the most significant events that catapulted U.S. involvement came in August 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin Incident. Reports claimed that North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked the USS Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin, prompting President Lyndon B. Johnson to request authorization from Congress to protect American forces and allies. The result was the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which granted Johnson nearly unchecked authority to increase U.S. military presence in Southeast Asia. Although controversies arose over whether the alleged second attack even occurred, the resolution effectively signaled the beginning of a massive American troop deployment. By 1965, tens of thousands of U.S. combat troops landed in Vietnam, transforming what was once a limited engagement into a large-scale war. Between 1965 and 1968, the U.S. employed a strategy called Search and Destroy, focusing on driving the Viet Cong out of their hideouts, capturing or killing as many enemy combatants as possible. Yet, the enemy was elusive. Viet Cong fighters blended with civilian populations and used extensive tunnel systems, ambush tactics, and landmines to disrupt American forces. The dense jungles and unfamiliar terrain gave the communist forces an advantage. Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, supported their efforts, providing additional manpower and resources. The U.S. attempted to break the North's resolve through sustained aerial bombardments, such as Operation Rolling Thunder. But these campaigns also took a heavy toll on civilian areas, stirring global condemnation. The Vietnam War's intensity was not limited to firefights in the jungle. It reverberated in the living rooms of the American public. This was one of the first conflicts extensively covered by television news, with daily footages of wounded soldiers, burning villages, and body counts. As journalists reported from the front lines, the stark realities of the war reached millions of households in the United States. Public opinion began to shift as more Americans questioned the justification for sending their sons, husbands, and friends to fight in a war that often seemed unwinnable. While some believed the U.S. had to stand firm against communist expansion, an ever-increasing segment of society became vocal critics, joining anti-war protests that swept college campuses and major cities. The slogan, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" captured the mounting anguish and anger. Amid this backdrop of rising domestic dissent, 1968 emerged as a pivotal year. On January 30th, the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, a series of coordinated attacks on more than 100 cities and outposts across South Vietnam. While the Communist forces suffered heavy casualties, the scale and audacity of the offensive shocked U.S. military leaders and significantly eroded the American public's confidence in the war effort. Televised images of fighting within the walls of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon contributed to a growing sense that victory was neither imminent nor guaranteed. Although U.S. and South Vietnamese forces ultimately repelled the offensive, the psychological impact was enormous. The war was no longer perceived as a distant conflict in a remote region, but as a grueling and uncertain struggle with no end in sight. The turbulence of 1968 did not end there. In March, the My Lai massacre came to light, revealing that American troops had killed hundreds of unarmed South Vietnamese civilians in the village of My Lai. This atrocity further fueled anti-war sentiments and undermined the moral authority of the U.S. mission. The American public and global observers alike questioned the integrity of the war effort. Was the U.S. truly defending democracy and freedom, or had the conflict devolved into an unmitigated quagmire of brutality and desperation? Controversies like My Lai further polarized opinions, intensifying calls for the withdrawal of American forces. As the war raged on, American policymakers found themselves caught between hawks who demanded a more aggressive approach to secure victory, and doves who insisted on an immediate withdrawal. The draft system, which conscripted young men into military service, became a hotbed of contention, especially among middle-class and working-class families who saw their loved ones forced to fight in a war they believed was unjust. The anti-war movement grew into a powerful cultural force, intertwining with other social movements of the 1960s, such as civil rights and the push for greater individual freedoms. This was an era of upheaval, where rock music festivals, mass demonstrations, and political rallies often featured impassioned speeches calling for an end to the war. When Richard Nixon took office in 1969, he introduced a policy known as Vietnamization. The primary objective was to reduce American troop involvement by shifting more combat responsibilities to the South Vietnamese Army. Concurrently, Nixon expanded the air war into neighboring countries like Cambodia and Laos, aiming to destroy communist supply routes and sanctuaries. However, these secret bombings raised further ethical and legal questions, as critics argued that the U.S. was undermining the sovereignty of neutral nations. While troop levels gradually decreased, the war's brutality persisted, and the conflict spilled across borders, entangling the region in further chaos. Back in the United States, the war's unrelenting presence fueled public outrage. The release of the Pentagon Papers in 1971 laid bare a series of government deceptions about the scope and progress of the conflict. Commissioned by the U.S. Department of Defense, this report showed that successive administrations had been more concerned with political repercussions than with real transparency about the war's chances of success. The gap between the government's official statements and the grim realities on the ground further undermined public trust. Protests turned more heated, culminating in tragic incidents such as the Kent State shootings in 1970, where National Guardsmen opened fire on unarmed student protesters, killing 4 and wounding 9. Despite deepening opposition, peace talks dragged on in Paris, and fighting continued in Vietnam. casualties mounted on all sides. The North's resilience surprised American strategists, who had anticipated that superior military technology would break Hanoi's will. But the determination of the Communist forces, combined with the complex nature of guerrilla warfare, made the war arduous and costly. Over time, the U.S. public grew weary, and politicians increasingly recognized that continued escalation would yield diminishing returns. International opinion also turned sharply critical, with many viewing the United States as an aggressor in what was largely a national liberation struggle. In 1972, the North Vietnamese launched the Easter Offensive, an all-out conventional invasion that tested the South Vietnamese Army's capacity to hold territory without substantial U.S. ground support. While the South did manage to halt the offensive with U.S. air support, the writing was on the wall. A political solution was needed. By late 1972, heavy bombings of North Vietnam, code-named Operation Linebacker 2, pressured the communist leadership to return to the negotiating table in earnest. The result was the Paris Peace Accords of January 1973. These accords required the withdrawal of all remaining U.S. forces, the return of American prisoners of war, and the establishment of a ceasefire across both North and South Vietnam. It seemed like peace was finally at hand, yet the fragile agreement did little to resolve the underlying tensions. With U.S. troops out of the picture, the conflict in Vietnam shifted primarily to a civil war between the North and the South. The South Vietnamese government, led by President Nguyen Van Thieu, struggled to maintain control and unity, especially as U.S. economic support waned and domestic issues plagued the administration. The North, bolstered by supplies from both the Soviet Union and China, continued to push southward, capturing territory and weakening the ARVN, Army of the Republic of Vietnam. By early 1975, the Communist forces launched a final series of offensives, culminating in the fall of Saigon on April 30, 1975. Scenes of desperate evacuations from the U.S. Embassy and helicopters lifting off rooftops became iconic images of the war's dramatic end. After the fall of Saigon, Vietnam was officially reunified under communist rule, marking the end of what had been a harrowing conflict that cost millions of lives, including civilians and combatants from all involved parties. For the United States, the war inflicted deep wounds, nearly 60,000 American lives lost, a nation sharply divided, and a global reputation tarnished by controversial military tactics and questionable political motivations. The veterans who returned home often faced indifference or outright hostility, with little support provided for their physical and psychological scars. Many struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, adjusting to civilian life, while grappling with painful memories of a war that lacked widespread support. In Vietnam, the aftermath was equally challenging. While North and South were unified politically, the country lay in ruins. Bombed-out infrastructure, unexploded ordnance, and the lingering effects of defoliants like Agent Orange plagued communities. Economic isolation, due in part to trade embargoes, hindered Vietnam's recovery. Over time, however, Vietnam began a gradual process of reform and reintegration into the international community. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, economic reforms known as Doi Moi helped spur growth, reducing poverty levels and modernizing certain sectors of the country. Diplomatic relations with the United States were normalized in 1995, paving the way for economic collaboration and, to a certain extent, healing old wounds. Globally, the Vietnam War left a lasting impact on military strategy, foreign policy, and public consciousness. Militarily, it exposed the limits of conventional power against guerrilla tactics and deeply motivated local populations. Politically, it showcased the potency of media coverage in shaping public opinion and, consequently, government decisions. The images broadcast from Vietnam into American homes played a critical role in swaying public sentiment. Governments worldwide took note of the Vietnam Syndrome, a public aversion to military interventions that might become drawn out or unpopular. This cautious stance influenced U.S. foreign policy for decades, prompting a more measured approach to foreign engagements, at least until new international crises arose in different parts of the globe. Another enduring legacy of the Vietnam War is the profound lesson on the complexity of ideological conflicts. While the Cold War lens framed Vietnam as a simple battle against communism, the reality was much more nuanced. Nationalism, historical grievances, and cultural dimensions factored just as heavily as global superpower rivalries. Efforts to compress the conflict into a binary East versus West paradigm overlooked the local context and the aspirations of Vietnamese on both sides. This disconnect, many analysts argue, contributed significantly to the miscalculations that mired the U.S. in a conflict with no clear exit strategy. Modern policymakers and military strategists often cite Vietnam as a cautionary tale when considering interventions abroad. For Vietnam veterans and their families, the war's memory is intimate and personal. Many soldiers were barely out of high school when they faced the horrors of combat. Tales of heroism, such as individuals risking their lives to save fellow troops, coexist alongside recollections of fear, uncertainty, and the moral ambiguities inherent in fighting a guerrilla war. Some veterans channeled their trauma into advocacy, working to ensure that their fallen and missing comrades were honored and that mental health resources were made available. In the U.S., the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C., stands as a somber tribute to those who lost their lives. For many, this monument serves as a place of closure, a tangible reminder of the human cost of war. Within Vietnam, the war is commemorated with various memorials and museums, primarily focusing on the heroism of the Viet Minh and Viet Cong fighters in driving out foreign invaders. The War Remnants Museum in Ho Chi Minh City, formerly Saigon, houses haunting photographs and exhibits that document the war's atrocities and consequences. Tourists visiting Vietnam can also see remnants like the Cu Chi tunnels, an extensive underground network used by Viet Cong fighters, highlighting their resilience and ingenious tactics. These sites serve both as historical lessons and as a testament to the extraordinary hardships endured by the Vietnamese people. Culturally, the Vietnam War sparked an outpouring of artistic expression, from documentaries and novels to songs and Hollywood blockbusters. Films like Apocalypse Now, Platoon, and Full Metal Jacket have shaped perceptions of the war for multiple generations. Musicians like Bob Dylan, Creedence Clearwater Revival, and Joan Baez crafted soundtracks of protest and reflection, mirroring the social turmoil of the 1960s and 1970s. Meanwhile, Vietnamese writers and filmmakers also contributed their perspectives, providing a more holistic, if less internationally disseminated, portrayal of the conflict's impact on local lives. This cultural engagement continues to evolve as newer generations interpret the war through fresh lenses. Today, As Vietnam emerges as a dynamic Southeast Asian economy and popular tourist destination, the war still echoes in many facets of life. Agent Orange continues to affect communities, as birth defects and environmental damage persist decades later. Veteran organizations from multiple countries work closely with Vietnamese NGOs to clear landmines and unexploded ordnance. Diplomatic and trade relations between Vietnam and the U.S. have steadily improved, culminating in strategic partnerships that would have been unimaginable in the immediate aftermath of the war. These shifts highlight the resilience of both nations and their capacity to move forward, even after one of the most polarizing conflicts in modern history. For scholars, the Vietnam War remains an enduring subject of study. Historians dissect archived documents, personal letters, and government memos to piece together the puzzle of a war that was, at once, local, regional, and global. Debates abound over whether it was winnable, whether it was moral, and what lessons can be drawn to prevent future calamities. Revisionist historians argue that the U.S. might have succeeded with different tactics or more robust support for South Vietnam, while others maintain that no amount of firepower could overcome the nationalistic fervor of Vietnamese determined to govern their own land. Regardless of one's stance, the war's complexity underscores the importance of understanding cultural, historical, and political contexts in any foreign intervention. Beyond academia, the Vietnam War continues to shape conversations on war ethics, the power of protest, and the role of journalism. The Living Room War, as it was sometimes called, demonstrated the capacity of television and photojournalism to alter public opinion dramatically. Eyewitness coverage brought the front lines into people's homes, challenging politicians who might otherwise have controlled the narrative. The war also underscored the moral weight that soldiers bear. Many were not only fighting an external enemy, but also struggling with questions of duty, honor, and the righteousness of their cause. Such moral quandaries resonate in contemporary conflicts, where drones, digital surveillance, and social media reconfigure how wars are fought and perceived. In examining the regional impact, the Vietnam War destabilized much of Southeast Asia. The bombings in Cambodia and Laos had dire consequences, contributing to the rise of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, a regime responsible for one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. Lao communities faced decades of hardship from unexploded ordnance. Meanwhile, countries like Thailand, the Philippines, and Australia became drawn into the U.S. alliance, sending troops or providing logistical support. The war's legacy in Southeast Asia is a potent reminder that conflicts often produce ripple effects far beyond their immediate battlefields. As we reflect on the meaning of the Vietnam War, it's essential to approach it not merely as a historical curiosity, but as a profound lesson on intervention, resilience, and humanity's capacity for both cruelty and courage. The war highlights the perils of underestimating an opponent's will, the ethical dilemmas of modern warfare, and the unpredictable outcomes of foreign entanglements. It also demonstrates the human cost of rigid ideological struggles, where ordinary people bear the greatest burdens. Today, memorials, museums, and documentaries serve as collective memories to ensure we do not forget the sacrifices made and the tragedies endured. For younger generations, the Vietnam War may seem distant, a relic of their grandparents' era. Yet, the themes it embodies remain startlingly relevant. How far should a nation go to counter an ideology it opposes? Is it justifiable to intervene militarily in another country's civil conflicts? What responsibility do global powers have in rebuilding war-torn nations once the fighting ends? The moral, strategic, and humanitarian questions posed by the Vietnam War continue to echo in debates over interventions in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and elsewhere. Understanding the war thus becomes a way of grappling with ongoing concerns about the ethics and efficacy of foreign policy. As we near the end of our exploration, it's important to acknowledge the deeply human elements that statistics and policy debates often overlook. The Vietnam War was fought by individuals, farmers turned guerrilla fighters, college kids drafted into service, nurses tending to the wounded, journalists risking their lives to document the truth, and countless innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. Their stories are poignant reminders of the resilience of the human spirit under unimaginable duress. Love, friendship, camaraderie, and hope could still blossom amid the chaos. Acts of kindness emerged on all sides, small beacons of humanity in a landscape of discord. The war also pushed the boundaries of technology and military innovation, from sophisticated helicopters and jets to the extensive use of chemical defoliants like Agent Orange. These methods left an indelible mark on the environment and populations. Stories of long-term health issues among veterans and Vietnamese civilians highlight the far-reaching consequences of modern warfare. Historians and policymakers study these outcomes to inform guidelines for future conflicts, especially regarding the ethical use of technology in war and the responsibility of nations to care for veterans and civilians alike. Despite the war's end over 4 decades ago, healing is an ongoing process for many. American veterans battle lingering trauma. Vietnamese families search for remains of missing relatives, and the environment continues to recover from massive deforestation. Various reconciliation efforts, such as cultural exchanges, business partnerships, and joint efforts to clear unexploded ordnance, reflect an emerging desire to move beyond the bitterness of the past. For many, traveling between the U.S. and Vietnam is a chance to bridge cultural divides, learn from past mistakes, and foster a new era of cooperation. Looking at the broader scope of how the Vietnam War shaped the late 20th century, it stands as a watershed moment that challenged the notion of American invincibility and reshaped global alliances. It forced the Pentagon to reevaluate doctrine and strategy, leading to changes that would manifest in later conflicts. Moreover, it galvanized a generation of activists who realized the power of collective protest and the importance of holding governments accountable. The war also demonstrated that a determined local force, supported by foreign allies but driven by nationalist fervor, could stand up to a global superpower, a lesson later seen in conflicts worldwide. When we set aside politics and ideology, the Vietnam War's core narrative is one of profound human struggle and the quest for self-determination. Both sides, North and South, along with their respective allies, believed they were fighting for freedom, sovereignty, and the future of their nation. This unwavering conviction fueled staggering sacrifices and unflinching courage. Today, Vietnam stands unified and is a rising player on the world stage, hosting international summits and forging partnerships that transcend old enmities. The United States and Vietnam now cooperate in areas like trade, education, and regional security, an astonishing turn of events for two nations once locked in brutal conflict. As we step away from the dense chapters of this war's history, let us not forget the importance of listening to first-hand accounts. War survivors, veterans, refugees, and journalists hold invaluable perspectives that enrich our understanding beyond textbooks. Their testimonies humanize the staggering figures of casualties and expenditures, reminding us that behind every statistic is a name, a face, and a story. In capturing these recollections, we preserve vital lessons for future generations, hoping to spare them the ravages of repeating history. The Vietnam War offers no easy resolutions or neat conclusions, but it remains a testament to the dire consequences that arise when misunderstandings, ideological rigidity, and geopolitical brinkmanship collide. With all these layers revealed, from the conflict's genesis in colonial struggles to its lasting legacy on veterans, politics, and global consciousness, we reach the end of our in-depth exploration. The Vietnam War stands as one of modern history's most complex and haunting chapters, a conflict that simultaneously highlighted heroism and atrocity, unity and fragmentation, resilience and profound loss. Its lessons are multifaceted, urging us to reflect on the nature of power, ideology, and humanity's capacity for both destruction and redemption. Ultimately, the Vietnam War remains a vivid reminder that every conflict exacts a heavy toll on societies and individuals, shaping the world in ways both immediately visible and quietly enduring. May we learn from its lessons and strive to forge paths of peace and understanding wherever possible. Thank you for joining us on this revealing journey into the Vietnam War, a conflict that continues to resonate and shape our understanding of global affairs. We hope this exploration has given you deeper insight into the complexities, sacrifices, and enduring lessons of this controversial chapter in modern history. If this video sparked your curiosity, please like, share, and subscribe for more content that dives into pivotal historical events and their lasting impact. By remembering the past, we can guide our present and inspire a more informed, empathetic future.